On April 20th, 1814, the Americans would run out of time. This whole adventure hinged on the fact that Napoleon Bonaparte was the undisputed master of Europe. Following a downturn of fortune, Napoleon was chased from Russia all the way back to Paris, where he was forced to abdicate on April 6th. Since 1808, the British had been fighting to aid their ally Portugal, maintaining about 50,000 regulars to fight the French, led by Marshal Jean de Soult, with General Arthur Wellesley pushing Soult all the way back to Toulouse in southern France, and then out of the city on April 10th, cementing Allied victory over Napoleon with an armistice soon after. With Napoleon captured and sent into exile, the British were no longer occupied in Spain and had time and veteran troops to deal with America. After the Battle of Lundy's Lane, the British attempted to recapture Fort Erie, with General Gordon Drummond laying siege to the fort from August 8th to September 21st. After September 16th, General Drummond realized he was unable to continue the siege due to heavy rains swamping the British camp, exhausting his supplies, as well as a disease outbreak amongst his men. The Americans were also stifled in any movements into Upper Canada following the completion of HMS St. Lawrence at the Kingston shipyard on September 10th. A first-rate ship of the line, the HMS St. Lawrence, despite not seeing battle, was more of a weapon of terror, her mere presence intimidating the Americans and preventing them from moving further into Ontario from the east, the Americans advancing no further than Cook's Mills. In the summer of 1814, General Prevost was ordered to destroy Sackett's Harbor in anticipation of the arrival of some 1,500 fresh regulars, half of them being veterans of the Peninsular War. The British were unable to crack the naval defenses of Sackett's Harbor, and the poor morale of the British Lake Ontario fleet caused several sailors and marines to desert to the Americans before what would have been the Third Battle of Sackett's Harbor. This intelligence leak caused Commodore Sir James Lucas Yeo to concede the lake to the Americans, not willing to risk the newly launched HMS St. Lawrence in a pitched battle with an inexperienced crew, leaving General Prevost with no naval support on Lake Ontario, forcing him to attack the extremely well-defended harbor or change his objective. General Prevost elected instead to clear a more direct route to the Hudson River, redirecting his attention to attack Plattsburgh and gain supremacy over Lake Champlain. Plattsburgh was defended by about 3,000 New York and Vermont militia, as well as a little over 3,000 regulars led by General Alexander Macomb, with the Lake Champlain squadron consisting of 14 warships, mostly gunboats, under Master Commandant Thomas McDonough. General Prevost led about 8,000 of the 11,000 troops at his disposal, many falling ill before the battle, with the British Lake Champlain fleet having some 16 ships of roughly equal tonnage to the Americans, though at the beginning of the battle, the flagship of Captain George Downey, who was in charge of the British on the lake, was not ready, arriving late and unprepared. The battle was decided on the lake, with Commandant McDonough defeating the British in an engagement known as the False Nile, paralleling Rear Admiral Sir Horatio Nelson's victory over Vice Admiral Francois Paul Bryes in 1789. The interesting thing militarily is Commandant McDonough defeated Captain Downey not from Admiral Nelson's position, but arranged his fleet like the much weaker French, using all the shoulda coulda wouldas the armchair admirals of the day wrote long screeds about how things would have gone if they were in the French position, to actual effect. General Prevost was meant to lead an attack upon the opening of the battle on the lake, but poor morale and loss of confidence in him among his officers led the British to a slower start. Before the British could engage the enemy on land, Captain Downey had been defeated. Upon receiving word of the defeat, General Prevost had seemed to lose his bottle mid-advance and ordered a retreat, much to the confusion of the men and chagrin of his officers. The retreat was so disordered that the British simply walked away from any supplies they couldn't carry, leaving powder, shot, and food where they were set up in camp. For this failure, General Prevost was recalled to London. Despite how things sound in the north, the British were not only making moves from Canada and were hammering the Americans on the eastern seaboard. The Royal Navy, no longer preoccupied with blockading Napoleon's France, immediately began attacking America. The British opened the Atlantic theater with an invasion of Maine, capturing Fort Sullivan, the easternmost fortification in America, on July 11, 1814, while General Sir John Cope Sherbrooke led 3,000 troops from Halifax, looting Hampton, Bangor, and Machias before occupying the town of Castine, re-establishing the colony of New Ireland for the remaining duration of the war. Over £10,000 collected in tariff duties from the New Ireland colony, called the Castine Fund, was used to found the Cambridge Military Library and Dalhousie University after the war. Since April 3, 1813, the British under Rear Admiral Sir George Cockburn had invested the Chesapeake Bay, being a good central point from which to blockade the great American port cities while using Bermuda as a base, as well as being of great economic importance to America and holding the prize of Washington, D.C. On May 3rd, the British raided Havre de Grace, Maryland, looting homes, burning warehouses, killing cattle, and destroying the Principio foundry, one of the few foundries in America capable of producing heavy artillery, along with the cannons it was making at the time. Later in June, the British attempted to capture Norfolk, Virginia, being repulsed at Craney Island on the 22nd. The British instead attacked Hampton, the landing being carried out by the independent companies of foreigners, composed entirely of French prisoners of war who agreed to fight for Britain in exchange for their freedom. The Americans accused the French soldiers of all manner of rape and pillage, with the British drawing criticism for using French prisoners. The British turned it around, though, spinning it as the French getting revenge for the Americans firing on a stranded boat during the invasion, essentially saying the Americans acted dishonorably and got what they deserved. The British were mostly focused on the American privateer navy, attacking the notorious pirate base at Ocracoke, North Carolina, leading into Pamlico Sound in July, capturing merchant vessels and cowing the Carolinians, who were unable to defend themselves after the privateers were run off. The British relented for winter, picking their offensive back up again in April of 1814, with Captain Richard Coote leading a small British force on a pre-dawn raid up the Connecticut River to the busy port and privateer base of Essex, destroying some 28 ships and making off with the town's stockpile of rope and rum, both worth about as much as the destroyed ships, dealing a devastating blow to American privateering activity in the North Atlantic. On June 1st, Commodore Joshua Barney attempted to dislodge the British from the Chesapeake with the ad hoc Chesapeake Bay Flotilla, consisting of barges and gunboats hastily constructed on the Pawtuxet River. The British quickly penned the improvised fleet into the river, and members of the flotilla would see more action on land than in the Chesapeake. In August, amid calls by Prevost for retaliation and Parliament seeking a political coup de grace to force the Americans to surrender, Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane, Commander-in-Chief of the North American and West Indies Station, ordered Rear Admiral Cockburn to attack a major city, with Cockburn choosing Washington, having spent considerable time and resources scouting out the lands around the Potomac. The Royal Navy was reinforced with about 3,500 veteran regulars under Major General Robert Ross, who had been wounded at the Battle of Orthez in the French Pyrenees in February, and about 1,000 Marines. General Ross was apprehensive at Cockburn's plan, believing his men would be vulnerable without cannons and cavalry, but Cockburn managed to convince him that so long as he struck hard and fast enough, the plan would work. The plan had two parts: a diversionary attack up the Potomac of Alexandria led by Captain James Gordon, with the main landing taking place at Benedict, Maryland. On August 20th, Captain Gordon began very noisily making his way up to Fort Washington, though this took much longer than anticipated, as his heavily laden bomb ships kept getting caught on the many shoals of the shallow river. The Secretary of War, General John Armstrong, correctly assessed that Gordon's fleet was a diversion. However, he incorrectly guessed that Admiral Cockburn's objective was the more economically important Baltimore, and did not reinforce Washington. On August 19th, General Ross had landed at Benedict, scattering the land forces of the Chesapeake Bay flotilla at Nottingham, before proceeding to Upper Marlborough. General Ross's men camped until the night of August 23rd. It was at this point General Ross defied General Armstrong, who assumed he would continue north to Baltimore, but Ross headed west, seeming to be headed for the bridge at Woodyard. In response, the defenders burned all the crossings on the Anacostia River, but General Ross was faking the defenders out, heading instead to the ford at Bladensburg, after plundering and burning Calverton, Huntingtown, Prince Frederick, Benedict, and Lower Marlborough. At Bladensburg, General Ross's men were opposed by Brigadier General Tobias Stansbury with 6,000 poorly trained and hastily assembled militia, with around 1,000 assorted regulars under the overall command of Brigadier General William Winder. General Stansbury was ordered by the Secretary of State, James Monroe, to reposition his men. Though the British were upon them, he complied. The militia's discipline, not doing so well before the last-second orders to move, crumbled when Colonel William Thornton's 85th Light Infantry crossed the river and actually began inflicting casualties. The militia collapsed. Shortly thereafter, the British began firing their Congreve rockets, sending the Americans into a rout and giving the Battle of Bladensburg another name, the Bladensburg Races, with much of the federal government in attendance nearly being captured, including James Madison. Commodore Joshua Barney, with 400 of his sailors and marines, valiantly covered their retreat, fighting with boarding pikes and cutlasses, though Barney was wounded and captured by the British, who congratulated him and let him go home. With the last of the defenses abandoned, General Ross was in the capital. Like York, those in charge of America's important documents at the Capitol were unconvinced that the British were wholly uninterested in the political statement that would come with destroying Washington, D.C. and its treasures. James Monroe tasked State Department Clerk Stephen Pleasanton to take the Declaration of Independence, the original Constitution, laws, letters from George Washington, as well as many unpublished journals of Congress, to a grist mill outside of Georgetown, where they would be out of reach. Pleasanton, fearing a nearby foundry would attract the British, who would burn the grist mill for good measure, secured wagons and continued on with the documents to Leesburg, Virginia, 35 miles away. After the Bladensburg, President Madison was evacuated to Brookville, Maryland. His wife Dolly stayed behind, intending to save what she could from the White House and flee to Virginia. She ordered her personal servant, the slave Paul Jennings, to save the Gilbert Stuart copy of George Washington's iconic Lansdowne portrait, breaking the frame and taking the canvas after realizing the painting was somewhat over-fastened to the wall. On August 24th, General Ross entered Washington. Opinions among historians on Ross's intentions are mixed, but the historian John McCavitt, in his 2016 work, The Man Who Captured Washington, Major General Robert Ross and the War of 1812, argues that Ross planned an orderly capture of the city until hidden American militia killed his horse and a few of his men, which precipitated a, quote, reluctant order to burn Washington. The British began by burning the Capitol, described by visitors as the only building of value in the district. The facade of the Capitol burned so quickly that the British were unable to get enough wood into the structure to damage the masonry walls, and the Capitol was left mostly intact, and reconstruction would be done by 1819. From there, the British sappers headed to the White House. Finding little treasure, they instead ate the feast President Madison intended to eat with the captured General Ross. This time, the sappers ensured enough wood was loaded into the building before lighting it up, necessitating total demolition and depriving the President of the White House until 1817. The British stuck to burning the public buildings, leaving only the Patent Office, which was saved by architect, inventor, and the Patent Office superintendent, William Thornton. During the razing, Thornton threw himself in front of a British cannon and implored the soldiers, asking, "Are you Englishmen or are you Goths and Vandals?" following it up with an impassioned, near-frantic speech that convinced the soldiers to leave the office standing. The next day, Admiral Cockburn entered the burned city, saving one memento from the president's office in the Capitol, an account of the receipts and expenditures of the United States for the year 1810, as proof he was there. Cockburn then attempted to have the newspaper The National Intelligencer, which published negative articles about him, burned, but pleas from the neighbors who feared the building would spread to the adjoining townhouses convinced him to pull the building down instead and burn only the C letters so they couldn't print his name again. The British only remained in the city for 26 hours. A sudden and violent storm, possibly a hurricane, blew into Washington, putting out the fires. A tornado also touched down on Constitution Avenue, throwing cannons and killing British troops and American civilians. Once the storm passed, the British returned to their ships and left for Baltimore. Ross's troops, now reinforced to 5,000 men, the largest invasion in United States history, were ferried to the north point of the Papsco Neck Peninsula east of Baltimore, landing on September 12th. The British landing force met American militia further up the peninsula and initiated the Battle of North Point. The militia were led by General John Stricker and inflicted heavy casualties on the British, but were ultimately forced off the field. During the battle, much of the British forces became lost in the dense woods and swamps of the Tidewater, though, more devastatingly, General Ross was killed by 2 American riflemen while attempting to reorganize his lost and confused men, turning his command of the army over to Colonel Sir Arthur Brooke before succumbing to his wounds, his body leaving the battle in a barrel of Jamaican rum. Colonel Brooke did not pursue the Americans, opting to wait until Fort McHenry had fallen to the Navy before pushing into the city. The next day, the British began bombarding Fort McHenry, the main fortification protecting Baltimore's inner harbor, expecting the 1,000-strong garrison led by Major George Armistead to abandon the fort once the heavy Congreve rockets began landing on them. After bombarding the fort all night, the defenders famously raised an oversized American flag, signaling they had not abandoned the city, inspiring the poet Francis Scott Key, who was detained on a British ship observing the battle, to write Defense of Fort McHenry, which was adapted by his brother-in-law Joseph H. Nicholson to the Anacreontic Song, the official song of a London music club of the same name, combining the two into the Star-Spangled Banner, which became viral among newspapers in America, going on to be adopted as the official national anthem of the United States in 1931. With Fort McHenry proving a tough nut to crack, Colonel Brooke led the British further up North Point Road, intending to put more pressure on McHenry from the land, encountering the redoubt of Rogers Bastion at modern-day Patterson Park on Hampstead Hill. While attempting to assault the fortifications around McHenry, the British realized they were outflanked by Major General Sam Smith, the planner and overseer of Baltimore's defenses, as well as the commander of the Maryland militia. Captain Charles John Napier was ordered to sail closer to McHenry to bombard Rogers Bastion and land Marines, but the defenders were too dug in, and fire from McHenry too fierce. Soon Napier and Brooks were both forced to retreat. Following the retreat of the land forces, the British left the Chesapeake, Admiral Alexander Cochrane focusing attention on what he assumed would be America's soft underbelly on the Gulf Coast. The British departed the North in a mixed position, while winning a stunning victory at Washington, embarrassing the Americans deeply. The loss of Tecumseh and his confederation in the West, as well as the stalemate in Canada with the victory of the Americans at Lake Champlain, Parliament and the British public, weary after a long hard fight against Napoleon, were turning against the war in America. Having suffered greatly after the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, the remaining Red Sticks fled south to the outpost the British established on the Apalachicola River at Prospect Bluff in Spanish Florida the previous month. Derisively called by the Americans Negro Fort, there the Red Sticks began to receive training from Royal Marine Major Edward Nichols, who was also attempting to gain support from the Seminoles and raise a corps of free black colonial Marines, hence the fort's name. The British, in the course of fighting the Peninsular War, had gained a friendship of sorts with the Spanish, and as far as Florida was concerned, were more than willing to accept British help against America, with the governor of West Florida, Don Mateo Gonzalez Manrique, even requesting Major Nichols to garrison troops in Pensacola. These moves in supposedly neutral Florida did not go unnoticed by the Americans, with General Andrew Jackson formally complaining to Governor Manrique over harboring America's enemies on July 12th, which simply made the governor redouble his pleas to Britain, now with a more panicked tone. The British opened the theater with a bombardment of Fort Bower on Mobile Point at the mouth of Mobile Bay on September 14th, culminating in an attempt to storm the small earthwork by Captain William Percy, with 120 Marines and native warriors. The attack ended in disaster, with the British losing 30 men and the sloop of war HMS Hermes, which ran aground during the attack, becoming hopelessly stuck and had to be scuttled, falling back to Pensacola. In response, General Jackson began preparing for an attack on Pensacola, despite explicit orders from James Monroe received on September 5th not to. Jackson, with 4,000 men, attacked Pensacola at dawn on November 7th. The sandy soil slowed down the American advance, but the Spanish and British trained defenders of the city surrendered Fort San Miguel by the end of the day. Jackson planned to march on the British-held Fort Barrancas on the 9th after spending the day securing the city, but the British blew up the fort and left before Jackson's men could make the 14-mile march. Jackson had captured Governor Manrique, who managed to prevent the war escalating further against Spain. A week after the battle, General Jackson received word the British were massing at Jamaica for an attack against New Orleans. General Jackson would reach New Orleans on November 19th with a force of only 1,000 regulars and 3,000 militia, with about 1,000 pirates, local volunteers, and slaves with which to build and man defenses. On December 14th, the British sailed into Lake Bourne, defended by a small fleet of American ships under Lieutenant Thomas Jones. The British, unable to sail into the shallow lagoon and meet the Americans, deployed Marines in 40 rowboats led by Commander Nicholas Lockyer. After 36 hours of rowing and 2 hours of actual fighting, the British had defeated the American flotilla, capturing all but one ship. The capture of Jones' fleet sent a wave of panic through New Orleans, prompting General Jackson to declare martial law. On December 23rd, a vanguard of about 1,800 troops led by General John Keane invaded the plantation of Major General Jacques Villeray, commander of the Louisiana militia, currently defended by his son Major Gabriel Villeray, 9 miles south of the city, intending to use the manor as a camp and staging area. Major Villeray saw the British coming, but not with a whole lot of time, and escaped through a window, bringing news to Jackson in New Orleans. Jackson counterattacked that evening, crossing the Rodriguez Canal and ambushing the British, before falling back and fortifying the northern bank of the canal as the Jackson Line. On Christmas Day, Major General Edward Pakenham, Adjutant General to and brother-in-law of Sir Arthur Wellesley, arrived at Keane's position and over the next few days began shoring up the men and unloading cannons, as well as a shot furnace from the ships. On December 28th, General Pakenham ordered a reconnaissance in force of Jackson's defenses, successfully sending the militia on the right of the earthworks fleeing, though a collapse on Pakenham's left spooked him and he pulled his men back, initiating an artillery duel that would last until New Year's Day. The artillery exchanged fire for 3 hours while the main British force joined the front line, and both sides began preparing for the ultimate showdown. On January 8th, the British commenced their final attack at dawn. Initially, their advance was covered by heavy fog, but as the sun rose, the fog lifted right before they reached the American line, and artillery fire began raining down on the British, panicking the advance guard led by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Mullins, whose frenzied retreat disorganized the main advance. Early in the assault, General Pakenham was mortally wounded by grapeshot. Complicating this further was the death of Pakenham's second-in-command, Major General Samuel Gibbs, as well as Colonel Robert Rennie. General Keane's light infantry managed to get on the redoubt, but withering fire from the second line and grapeshot inflicted great casualties. Those British that managed to get over the defenses, including Keane himself, were captured. General Pakenham had passed command to General John Lambert, who managed the retreat. All in all, the British lost nearly 300 dead and over 1,200 wounded, with also 400 missing or captured. The British had managed to capture the defenses on the right bank of the Mississippi, with the intentions of turning those guns on Jackson, though they landed too late, and that small toehold on the wrong side of the river was not enough to justify continuing the invasion in the face of such devastating losses. Complicating matters, the British were also unable to sail up the Mississippi due to Fort St. Philip, which, despite being reduced to rubble, withstood 10 days of bombardment and still prevented the British from passing upriver. General Lambert fell back and attacked Fort Bower again, this time capturing it on February 12th in an attempt to renew an invasion of Alabama. But soon after, news of the Treaty of Ghent arrived, canceling General Lambert and Admiral Cochrane's offensive. Peace negotiations began on August 8, 1914, in the neutral city of Ghent in the United Netherlands, now Belgium. After 5 months of negotiations, with the fortunes of both sides shifting back and forth, the appetite among the British and American negotiators, politicians, and public for punitive concessions in land waned, ending in status quo antebellum, the situation as it existed before the war, with both sides returning their captured lands, though the Americans would gain more sovereignty over West Florida and took control of Mobile. The treaty was agreed upon by both parties on December 24, 1814, and was approved and signed into law in Britain on the 30th. Taking longer to reach America, the Senate quickly ratified the treaty on February 17th, officially ending the war after 2 years, 7 months, and 30 days, with the Americans losing more than 15,000 men and the British over 10,000, with various indigenous allies losing another 10,000. For Britain, the war was little more than an odd sideshow to the more important Napoleonic wars, with the privateering activity as well as the loss of the American markets affecting British insurance rates and market prices being the real annoyance to the British public, who were eager to resume trade following Napoleon's defeats. Although prices in America rose as high as 15%, the lack of British competition was a boon for American domestic manufacturing, with groups such as the Boston Associates making a killing. In Canada, the Canadian people were forever cleaved from America culturally, with the governments of the various Canadian colonies encouraging this split by restricting American immigration and discouraging Americanized institutions like the Methodist Church in favor of British immigrants and the Anglican Church. Taking a page from the French, the British began a refortification campaign in Canada, renovating and expanding existing fortifications, as well as establishing new forts in the face of any potential future American aggression, though both sides would agree in the Rush-Bagot Treaty of 1817 to demilitarize the Great Lakes. I also have to mention Major Nichols' black soldiers were left to hold Fort Negro until 1816, when it was destroyed by Jackson during the Seminole Wars. All the survivors were forced back into slavery, and the Americans built Fort Gadsden on top of the old British outpost. For the Americans, the war was a reaffirmation of the sovereignty of the United States, and proof their republic was more than just a flash in the pan. Immediately following the war, America entered the era of good feelings, as well as the collapse of the Federalist Party and the emergence of an American national identity as more than just rebellious colonials. The British, too, would treat America with more respect going forward, and, barring a few heated diplomatic incidents, the proclamation of friendship made between Great Britain and the United States in the Treaty of Ghent would last unbroken to this day. While some laymen and cynical historians would denounce the War of 1812 as the seed of America's belligerent foreign policy, or a war without reason that accomplished nothing, I hope that after watching this series on America's Second War of Independence, you'll have a little better understanding of why this war was so important, not only to the United States, but Canada and Britain as well. This war wasn't one of conquest or annihilation or subjugation, but more of a weird sort of civil war with both sides speaking the same language and sharing a common culture. This felt more to me like a fight between father and son with Britain, and the continued sibling rivalry the Americans and Canadians have had for long before this. A war over respect, to force Britain to honor the terms of the American Revolution, and to respect the republic their fathers created. That if it had not been fought, would have dishonored the sacrifices of the Revolution, and disgraced America as a nation for all time. Thank you for watching or just listening. If you like this video, hitting the like button and subscribing to Mid-Atlantic Chronicles is a great way to show that. If you have a topic from early American history you would like to see me cover, or just have something to say, feel free to leave a comment below. Thank you again.